warrior king of faith and fury. His believers wait for him to return, to save us all from peril. But is he man or myth?
Where he came from and who he was, that is the big mystery.
We shine a light into the mysterious world of the Dark Ages to reveal the truth behind King Arthur. A quest for the truth behind King Arthur begins. Andrew Goff, an Arthur seeker, is following in the footsteps of one of history's most elusive characters.
I have been enchanted with the legends of King Arthur my entire life, since I was a child. Movies, books, stories my parents used to tell me. And now I'm here to explore that legend.
Andrew investigates the legendary king's life, from his birth to death, and into the world of the paranormal. On the Atlantic coast of Cornwall, overlooking the Celtic Sea, lie the ruins of Tintagel Castle, built on the site where legend has it that Arthur was brought into this world.
We're flying over Tintagel. This is the first time I've seen it. It's an imposing fortress. Could this be the birthplace of King Arthur? To find out, I'm going to have to get my feet on the ground.
It may be myth, but the tale of King Arthur's life has captivated us for centuries. An enduring story of a righteous leader bringing peace and prosperity to the ancient people of Britain.
Arthur is part of the tradition of bravery and morality and truth and justice.
King Arthur holds court at his castle called Camelot with his Knights of the Round Table, aided by his supernatural sidekick Merlin, armed with his magical sword Excalibur. King Arthur fights those that threaten his kingdom, where honor and integrity prevail.
He can fight, he's romantic, he forgives. He embodies all the elements of a modern-day superhero.
In his last battle, King Arthur is grievously wounded by his own son, Mordred. Excalibur is offered to the mysterious Lady in the Lake, and Arthur disappears to the Vale of Avalon. Legend has it that he will someday return to save Britain at its time of greatest need, the once and future king.
Arthur is sleeping somewhere in suspended animation, waiting to come back to save his people.
Today, Arthur and the whole legend about his return is more important to us than ever before, because there's this general fear that perhaps we're in trouble and the planet needs some help.
One might say that, well, we no longer need an Arthur figure, but we do. The world is at this time really unsure of itself because of the financial crisis, natural disasters, global warming, and possible world war. So at a time like this, Arthur figures are needed. They represent hope.
King Arthur so epitomizes the idealized leader that his legend has been connected to some of history's most powerful figures. Most famously, the term Camelot was used to describe JFK's government in the 1960s.
Ask not what your country can do for you. Ask what you can do for your country.
Poignantly, his widow, Jacqueline, would recite, "There will be other great presidents, but there will never be another Camelot." Such is the power of the legend of Arthur.
The idea of a medieval Arthur the romanticized leader of the Knights of the Round Table, is intoxicating. But it's widely known that this is myth. But could the myth have been inspired by a historical figure? A real King Arthur, an important chieftain of the 5th or 6th century, fighting to defend the ancient people of Britain in the Dark Ages.
Most legends do come from a true story and have a grain of truth within them. It is very possible that something occurred here, that some hero lived during the Dark Ages, and that we've passed that down as the legend of Arthur.
In the 5th century, King Arthur's Britannia was in anarchy. The Romans had left. Tribes of Angles and Saxons from Denmark and Germany were on the attack. They started to seize control from the native Britons. Then eventually something, or someone, brought them to a temporary halt. Some historians think this could have been the real King Arthur. But did this ancient superhero ever exist? Or is he also more fiction than fact? 3 Arthur seekers embark on a quest to find out.
In my opinion, King Arthur is the biggest legend of them all, and one that has to be cracked.
Every element of his life story will be analysed, from his birth, his reign at Camelot, and the mystery surrounding his death.
We're looking for something to believe in, and then we're looking for the science that backs up those stories.
Are we talking about a literary figure, or are we talking about a historical figure? And to answer that question, we have to look at where the whole legend of Arthur comes from.
The investigation into the life of a possible real King Arthur begins at Tintagel, a small coastal village in Cornwall in the southwest of England. Andrew wants to take a closer look at Arthur's supposed birthplace. But closer scrutiny of this possible historical figure may prove to be difficult.
When people talk about Arthur, they talk about them as though they're talking with the reverence of a god. And consequently, people bring so much to that all they want to do is find elements of it to draw on today. Nobody really wants to look at what the truth may very well be.
Tintagel has had links with King Arthur since the 12th century. Archaeology backs up the idea that this coastal settlement was a major trading hub at the time when the real King Arthur supposedly ruled. Some historians claim it may even have been a royal fortress. In 1998, a new frenzy of speculation begins after a shocking discovery.
As they turned over one of these slates, there was an inscription, or a broken piece of inscription, underneath the slate. It didn't actually say Arthur was here, but it said Arthno.
It was close enough for the Arthur believers.
I always think of this as the birthplace of King Arthur, but I think this slate sort of nudged other people to possibly thinking the same.
The discarded slate was quickly christened the Arthur Stone.
There it is, A-R-T, right?
Arthno, a descendant of Cole, had this made.
So it was pretty much graffiti. Arthur was here.
Arthur was here, yes.
And this is the only place where the word Arthur has been found inscribed in any piece of archaeology on the site, right?
It is indeed.
The slate was found in the remains of this ruined building, reused as part of a drain cover. It's since been securely dated as a genuine 6th century find.
So for you personally, Rob, does this prove anything?
It proves that there was a name similar to Arthur here at that time, but Of course, being Cornish and a Celt, this is Arthur's birthplace as far as I'm concerned.
What I find interesting is that of all the archaeological record there, there's only one piece of slate that has any name associated with it. And what does it say? It could say Arthur. Okay, maybe coincidental, but it's interesting.
Andrew travels deeper into the heart of England to find out more. But he's not the only one intrigued by the legendary king. Arthur researcher Mary Ann O'Hotter wants to explore the myths that make up the Arthur story and unearth their historical origins. She starts with a myth that saw the boyhood Arthur grow into a king, the sword in the stone.
When you look at the origins of the legend, there are, I think, kernels of truth that, as an anthropologist, I'm fascinated in. And they draw on universals that we find in folklore across time and across cultures.
The story describes a gleaming sword thrust into a huge stone, and only the rightful King of Britain could pull it out. The fiercest warlords and the strongest soldiers tried in vain to free the blade. But then, young Arthur stepped forward.
It was easy because Arthur is the rightful and true king of the Britons.
Mary Ann O'Hotter meets with a metal worker who uses the practices of the ancients. She's investigating the origins of the sword in the stone story.
What I want to do is go and find out more about ancient sword-making techniques, because I think that might cast some light on this element of Arthur's legend.
I suppose the sword we're going to cast would look something like this when it's finished.
That is beautiful. Is this the kind of sword for a warrior king?
Definitely. I think swords belong to the aristocracy. They're a very expensive piece of technology.
A charcoal furnace heats a crucible containing tin and copper to form molten bronze. The bronze is poured into a single stone mould that forms the sword.
Right, what we're going to do now is draw the sword out of the stone mould.
Or draw the sword out of the stone, even?
Yeah, definitely.
That's absolutely incredible. From that, you can see where the myth from the sword in the stone comes from.
Yes.
Metallurgy is a pretty magical process. You take this raw material and with skilled hands you can transform it into a glittering weapon. That might be, and I have to give it some weight, that might be the origin of the story of the sword in the stone.
There could be some truth to elements of the King Arthur story. According to legend, Arthur the Boy would grow into an all-powerful warrior, destroying many enemies. He would rule from the legendary Camelot, a romantic castle city at the heart of the Arthurian legend.
Camelot is truly a utopia on earth. It's where men behave with justice and society is safe from their enemies and all is right in the land.
Andrew wants to find out if there was ever a real Camelot. The real King Arthur would have lived, fought, and died in a basic hill fort. If Andrew is going to find the real Camelot, he needs to look for the remains of a similar Dark Age stronghold, not the romanticized medieval castle of popular myth. One of the strongest contenders is located 19 kilometers from the town of Glastonbury, an ancient hill fort called Cadbury Hill.
the home of Arthur should look like this. It's not a glossed over sort of Disneyland full of big castles with large turrets and none of that. This is exactly what you would expect for the realm of King Arthur.
A 16th century writer was the first to claim that this was Camelot. He reportedly spoke to locals who stated that King Arthur ruled from here centuries ago. It's a belief that continues to this day.
What historical elements do we have? What pillars can we put a stake in the ground with and say, this is a fact?
This was probably the most strategic fortification in southern England.
Right.
And by virtue of simply of these great four ramparts that surround the hill.
Although it doesn't look like much now, in Arthur's time, Cadbury's defences were deadly and imposing. 800 men would have been necessary to man them. This was a mighty fortress, the seat of a leader of warlords. The chieftain who ruled from here could have been the historical figure that became known as King Arthur.
We have enormous evidence of occupation here in Arthurian times. Not only do we have these massive ramparts, but also we have the remnants of a banqueting hall.
The Dark Age timbered hall was 18 meters long by 9 meters wide. A banqueting hall big enough for any warlord to entertain and forge links with other leaders. Could Cadbury really be the Dark Age Camelot?
I really feel that Arthur's stamp is here upon this hill.
The evidence that this is where the Dark Age Arthur may have lived seems to stack up.
It's located on a hill over 500 feet in the air with a 360-degree view. It has 4 levels of embankments for fortification, and the archaeology reveals that at the time of Arthur, this site was inhabited. I can think of no better candidate for Camelot than Cadbury.
But Arthur writer Graham Phillips doesn't agree. He thinks King Arthur's fortress wasn't in the southwest of England. He places it 200 kilometers north in the county of Shropshire. Graham's search for proof that the real Dark Age king lived in Shropshire begins just outside the village of Wroxeter. In Roman times, this was a bustling town called Viraconium, home to over 10,000 people. In the 1980s, archaeologists make a startling discovery. Somebody was refortifying here in the Dark Ages. At a time when most of the Britons were in retreat, it seems they were making a stand here.
That this must have been the stronghold of a particularly important and powerful warlord. Well, this is exactly the time Arthur lived. And my research suggests that Arthur came from here. So it seems the archaeology is backing this up.
Graham thinks this is the historical fortress of the warlord Arthur. If he could find out who lived here around 500 AD, he might be able to discover the identity of the real King Arthur. Ancient texts provide him with more clues.
They all agreed that around about 500 AD, the person who ruled from Viraconium was it Arthur? No, it was a man called Owen Llan Gwyn. So, first of all, I was very disappointed.
But Graham refuses to give up on the idea that the Dark Age Arthur came from Shropshire.
It was a Celtic practice for warriors, chieftains, to adopt the name of an animal as an honorary title, in some way, shall we say, portraying their prowess in battle. Was Arthur a battle name rather than his real name?
After months of painstaking research, Graham develops a theory. In the Dark Ages, Arth was the word for a bear, and Owen Llan Gwyn's battle name was the bear. He could have been known as Arthurus or Arthur.
His name was Arth. He ruled from the place that seems to have been, if you like, the historical Camelot. At that point, I began to think, oh my goodness, I'm onto something.
Graham Phillips thinks the real King Arthur defended his kingdom here, in Shropshire, England. A warrior king called Owain Thangwyn, nicknamed the Bear, or Arth.
The next thing was to find out, where was he buried?
This ancient hill in the middle of the Shropshire countryside could reveal all. Graham thinks that what lies beneath here could prove that Owain Thangwyn lived and died here. The basis for this theory, a 10th century poem. It describes how the old kings of Viraconium are buried here, close to the churches of Bassa.
There is a village today called Bass Church. The churches of Bassa, Bass Church, there's nothing else anywhere in that region that sounds anything like it.
The archaeologists follow Graham's hunch and begin their search on this small hill nearby. Underneath the ground here are the remains of an ancient fort and settlement.
We're now at the approximately acre of land where it would appear, according to the poem, that the kings of Paris were buried. And I'm hoping that we may find evidence that King Arthur himself was buried here.
The archaeologists can't dig here. It's a protected site on private land. But new technologies allow them to get an idea of what lies beneath. This early data suggests there's something interesting.
Then you can see the ditch around it coming around there. Okay. What we're getting is a very strong magnetic signal on that plot, which says that there's a big lump of iron in there. Could be an axe or a sword or a shield.
Intriguingly, there also appears to be a larger structure around this mystery object.
It can't be a house. It's far too small to be a house. So it's likely, therefore, to be a burial. We can't see any other burials around this one. This is a single, isolated grave, so likely to be someone important.
There's definitely something buried here, but the full results of the geophysical scan will need time to be processed. Only then will Graham know if his theory about the real King Arthur stands up to scrutiny.
This is really, really encouraging. Right in the middle of this site, we have, this is a circular ditch, but in the centre of it, that black oblong there, that is the ferrous, in other words, iron object that could be the centre of a shield known as a shield boss in a circular grave. This here, where that stake is now, could be marking the very burial site of King Arthur himself.
Looking for archaeological evidence of the Dark Age king is just one way of solving this mystery. Mary Anna Hotter is searching for the real historical events that may have inspired the legend. One element of the King Arthur story has intrigued us for hundreds of years. The Lady in the Lake.
The Lady in the Lake is a character who introduces the sword Excalibur to Arthur. And the Lady of the Lake appears and she says to him, "Would you like the sword?" And it's a sword that's held in a magical hand in the middle of the water. And Arthur's delighted with this beautiful sword. This is the sword Excalibur, with its magical powers to protect him, and it's going to be with him for the rest of his life.
But King Arthur's reign comes under threat. According to legend, he has to fight his own son, Mordred. In a final battle, Mordred dies, but only after he inflicts a grievous wound on his father.
As he's dying, he orders his knight, Bedivere, to take his sword Excalibur to the shores of the lake and to throw it into the water. He takes the sword and he closes his eyes and he throws it into the water. And out of the water, the same enchanted hand comes and it grabs the sword and it brandishes it in the air. and then both sword and hand disappear into the water. And that's the end of Excalibur.
These ancient, twisted pieces of wood tell a story and could provide the clues to what might have inspired the Lady in the Lake myth. This is a unique ancient monument. 3,500 years ago, this was a wooden causeway and platform. It seems it was used by Celtic fen people as a place of worship. They saw the surrounding water as a sacred place and made countless sacrificial offerings here.
Do you think that from the humble beginnings here of ancient people throwing swords into the water, we've got the kernel of the truth behind the Lady of the Lake?
Yes, I do. Because this kind of thing was practiced everywhere. This is just an area where we definitely have discovered it. And of course, it's passed down, and most definitely, I would say that this is the kind of thing that would lead to the legend of the Lady in the Lake.
The Lady in the Lake could be a memory of a very real act carried out in ancient times.
Even now, when you're throwing a penny into a wishing well, you're engaging in what is a very, very ancient, not fully understood tradition of making an offering to something where water and life come together. And I think when you're talking about Arthur's dying wish be that Excalibur be thrown back into the water from where it came, I think on an instinctual level, we all understand the power of that act.
This ancient lake is about 1/4 kilometre from the hill fort where Graham Phillips thinks the real King Arthur might be buried.
So if Arthur was actually buried at the hill or near the hill there, then the nearest lake would be where his sword was thrown.
If sacrificial or votive offerings were made here in the Dark Ages, they could still be found.
So this lake here could very well be where the historical Arthur's sword, the real Excalibur, may lie.
Graham Phillips thinks the sword of a real King Arthur might have been thrown into this lake as a sacrifice. A team of marine archaeologists begin their scan of this body of water, searching for artifacts that could prove that this is more than just a theory.
If someone was buried here, his sword very much could have been cast into the lake. Who was buried here is the question. If it was Arthur, or the hero that we now remember as Arthur, then it's possible we have a sword that's come down to us in legend as Excalibur.
The team survey the lake using sonar to see just what's down below.
Hopefully, this scientific equipment is going to be able to find out if there's really something at the bottom of that lake. Hopefully, the sword of the historical King Arthur, Excalibur.
The archaeologists use an underwater metal detector to try and find any artifacts. It seems this lake may have been considered sacred. Precious objects have been found here. But now, the team has to find King Arthur's legendary sword.
We've just had the reading go from completely as far as it'll go to the negative, right the way through to the positive. It means something's affecting the Earth's magnetic field, normally a big heap of metal. We've got something huge sitting up at this end of the pool nearest to the hill fort.
If precious objects were offered as sacrifices over hundreds of years, the team could be dealing with a large amount of metal. The divers disappear into this dark body of water.
Obviously, he can't see anything down there, so he's having to actually feel his way round.
The diver systematically searches the bottom of the lake in a circular pattern.
This lake may have had 5,000 years of votive offerings, right up to modern day. We're looking for one particular offering in that 5,000 years worth of history.
After an hour underwater, the search ends in disappointment.
You're not actually seeing anything. You've got no point of reference. Zero vis, deep silt, and cold.
The meters of silt at the bottom of the pool makes it mission impossible.
You could throw a car in there and it would just disappear into the mud.
Whatever gave the reading on the metal detector is simply impossible to find.
The chances of you finding it without dredging the lake? 0.
No sword of a Dark Age king has been found, no ancient artifacts, and certainly no Excalibur.
When you're trying to look back at the Dark Ages or the Roman period, you have to accept that sometimes you're not going to actually get through the layers of history and get the answers you want. But I was so hopeful we'd find something under there.
It's a real blow for Graham's theory, but the results of the archaeological survey are still being processed. They could soon prove that an ancient warlord lived, died, and was buried nearby.
I suppose in some ways, some would say that it's been a bit of a victory for the skeptics that nothing has been found. But I look at it as being yet another step towards finally being able to put the whole of the jigsaw together.
Arthur's death and burial remain an eternal riddle. Legend describes the wounded Arthur being sailed to the mysterious Isle of Avalon. But with so few clues, tracking down the legendary king is no easy task.
King Arthur is associated with all kinds of Celtic countries. So now you have England, and not just England, but all parts of England, the north, the south, the west in particular. You have Scotland, Ireland, France, Italy, even Russia has laid claim to King Arthur.
Whilst Graham Phillips' search for King Arthur in Shropshire continues, Andrew investigates the idea that the Dark Age warlord was born, lived, and died in the southwest of England, in Glastonbury, in the county of Somerset. It's here that believers claim that hard evidence of King Arthur was discovered in the 12th century.
We're told that he was taken to the Isle of Avalon, and nothing fits the bill better than Glastonbury, which used to be an island, and in 1190 announced that they had found the bodies of King Arthur and Guinevere. That is still the best historical evidence we have for the resting place of King Arthur.
In the late 12th century, a mystery that's lasted over 800 years begins. According to medieval accounts, the monks at Glastonbury Abbey discover a huge wooden coffin containing a male and a female skeleton.
The female skeleton still had golden hair, which, as one of the monks leant down to pick it up, crumbled in his hands.
The monks also find a lead cross near the coffin.
There was an inscription on a cross on top of this tomb saying that this was the body of King Arthur and his second wife, Guinevere.
The supposed discovery has quite an impact.
So certainly had the very real Arthur that really exists. So repercussions of that over the next 800 years to the modern day, huge, massive.
Even today, the site of the legendary king's supposed grave remains a place of pilgrimage. Many are convinced that what was discovered 5 meters under the ground here was proof of Arthur's existence.
So, Gordon, is this truly the tomb of the legendary King Arthur?
Yes, it is. And
how do we know that?
Well, because the tomb was found here, the coffins were found here of Arthur and Guinevere.
So what evidence was there with the tombs that would associate King Arthur in the first place?
In the coffins was found this cross. This is a replica of the original that was found with King Arthur and Guinevere.
According to medieval accounts, the inscription on the cross reads, "Here lies the renowned King Arthur, in the Isle of Avalon." Gordon has researched the accounts of the discovery and thinks they're true. But some historians think the unearthing was an elaborate 12th century hoax. They're suspicious about the real motive of the monks.
collapse, the oldest church in the monastery had burned down by accident in 1184, leaving the monks with a severe cash crisis and also a problem of attracting back pilgrims to a burnt-out abbey. They needed sponsorship. They needed somebody famous, and Arthur was on the mental map at that time.
You could say that the monks were desperately in need of funds at that particular time, but I don't think that that's enough evidence to say that Arthur isn't here.
Fake or not, the two royal skeletons were supposedly moved to a more regal tomb after their discovery.
So this is where the bodies eventually ended up.
That's amazing. Are you telling me that his body, Arthur and Guinevere, were here for what? Over 300 years?
What remains when they were transported from where we were before were brought to this place, to the high altar, and a tomb was built.
Do you believe that King Arthur and Guinevere were here in this spot for over 300 years?
I most certainly do.
The abbey was destroyed in the 16th century. All evidence of the tomb and the bodies disappeared. But the mystery still endures.
Could have been Arthur. Two problems. First is the monks had an appallingly clear incentive for finding anybody approximating to Arthur in a hurry, and it worked. The other thing is that the cross was forged in the wrong way, so whoever drew it up got the dating wrong when he forged it by a few hundred years.
It seems Arthur was attracting hoaxers even 900 years ago.
From the get-go, the very attempt of claiming the heritage of the bodies of Arthur and Guinevere is a hoax. And that's not to say that the abbey isn't sanctified, isn't sacred, but is it associated with Arthur? I have my doubts.
There is no concrete evidence for Arthur's body in Glastonbury, but further north in Shropshire, Graham Phillips' quest goes on. His work with archaeologists suggests there could be an underground chamber near the mound where he thinks the real King Arthur lies. Metallic readings have also showed evidence of an object that could be the middle of a king's shield, otherwise known as a boss.
Graham thinks there is a burial of a Dark Age king there, buried in the crouch position with his shield placed on top.
After a 2-week wait, the full results are ready.
My hope is that somehow we can find some archaeological or scientific evidence that the remains of Arthur lie here.
Extensive analysis of the results collected at the supposed burial site paint a more reliable picture of what's underground. Archaeologist Andrew Hatton has a much clearer idea of the size of the buried metallic object.
Geophysical survey picked up a large ferrous anomaly, and as you can see, it's approximately 2.5 meters long, which is far larger than the shield boss, which is approximately 20 centimeters in diameter, which kind of negates the idea that it's actually a burial under there, from that point of view anyway. The geophysical survey also picked up what could be seen as a rectangular structure. And if you see it within the context of the large ferrous object, it kind of suggests that this is actually the location of a furnace as opposed to a burial site, which is a pity. I'm sure everybody would like to find him.
Despite no hard evidence for the real Arthur in Shropshire, Graham's search for the legendary king will continue.
From the skeptic's point of view, we haven't found proof that Arthur was here. But what we have done is to find a few more pieces of the jigsaw. All we need is for science to advance archaeology just a little bit further, and I am 100% convinced we'll find King Arthur.
Every generation brings King Arthur up to date. New characters were added to the tale by romance writers, and other elements taken away because of the leaders of the time. But one 15th century writer would shape how we see King Arthur more than any other: Sir Thomas Malory. His book is Le Mort d'Arthur, which translates as The Death of Arthur.
It's fantastic. It says the most ancient and famous history of the renowned Prince Arthur, King of Britain. Is this the definitive story?
In many ways it is, certainly in English. Malory was a compiler and a translator, and he's sort of hoovering up all the different myths and legends about King Arthur, and he's putting them together into a single story in English for the first time.
Malory wrote the first complete tale of Arthur's life, incorporating most of the elements we know today, defining how Arthur is depicted in film and on TV.
This picture's beautiful, but this isn't a picture of Dark Age warriors, is it?
No, no, certainly not. This is an image of late medieval knights with late medieval armor and weaponry. Certainly Malory is interested in creating an Arthur for his own time, and part of this project is making Arthur not sort of an ancient Celtic king or early British king, but actually a Christian king, a late medieval Christian king.
It's Malory who turned Arthur into the knight in shining armor that we know now. It's such an established interpretation that getting beyond it to the real King Arthur is no easy task.
I think he's a mixture of Celtic mythology, of ancient practices involving swords and weapons and spiritual figures, and medieval romance. And I think there's a little bit of the contemporary. Arthur is who we want him to be.
Mary Ann's quest has come to an end. Andrew's journey across the southwest of England has taken in the birth, life and death of the renowned king. But what do historians think of the evidence? They begin by taking a closer look at the idea that King Arthur was born in Tintagel.
Well, we actually have no concrete evidence that Arthur was born in Tintagel. Our earliest source is Geoffrey of Monmouth, the writer of the pseudo-history, the History of the Kings of Britain.
And Geoffrey of Monmouth is a questionable historical source.
He never claimed that this is truth. He quite honestly said this is a story of the kings of Britain.
But what about the so-called Arthur Stone found here? The analysis of the inscription reveals a problem.
Any student of onomastics, which is the study of the origins of proper names, will tell you that the name that's written on the slate, Artognu, is in no way related to the name Arthur.
160 kilometers from Tintagel is the ancient hill fort of South Cadbury. The archaeology discovered here adds some weight to this site being the Camelot of a Dark Age Arthur.
Calling Cadbury Camelot is a leap of faith. If it's a fortress, for how high-ranking a person, it's wide open for judgment.
For historians, there's no concrete evidence that Cadbury is the fortress of a king, let alone one called Arthur. Every element of King Arthur's life has now been scrutinized. The magical Arthur of the Sword in the Stone and the Lady in the Lake is known to be a product of centuries of imagination, shaped by writers like Sir Thomas Malory. And it seems the evidence for Arthur as a real Dark Age warlord in both Shropshire and the southwest has been debunked. In fact, there's no hard proof of him ever existing at all.
It's actually incredibly difficult in history to prove a negative, and I, for one, am not sorry about it. I'm very glad that people have options here, choices, can follow their instincts, so there can be many Arthurs for many people today, including no Arthur at all for some.
The real King Arthur myth has been set straight, but the story of this ancient king and his return to save us still resonates.
I feel that this notion of the once and future king is very real. What I do know is we shouldn't worry about Arthur's return, because he's still here